What if Daniel and Helen were never actually taken because they knew too much? What if they were taken because someone wanted them to know more? That distinction could completely change the meaning of the entire Before Time storyline in Silo Season 3. Episode 7 makes it look like Daniel, Helen, and Charlotte have stumbled into the deepest secret on Earth, but look at how carefully everything happens. Their vehicle is taken over, they're brought to a secure location, they're confronted with Senator Thurman, they're offered access to information that could expose the entire foundation of the Silo Project. And then Per Stenson enters the picture. The strange part isn't that Stenson has the power to silence them. The strange part is that he chooses to show them the truth instead. Why? Why allow a journalist like Helen anywhere near the project? Why give Daniel access to information he's been chasing? Why reveal the enormous drilling operation in Georgia instead of simply locking them away and protecting the secret? Unless Stenson doesn't see Daniel and Helen as threats at all. Unless he sees them as exactly what he needs. That's where this theory starts to become much more interesting. Daniel and Helen aren't ordinary witnesses. Daniel has already been investigating the strange chain of events surrounding Charlotte, memory manipulation, and the people behind the operation. Helen is even more dangerous because she's a journalist. Her entire instinct is to question authority, find contradictions, and eventually tell the public what she discovers. Stenson knows this. Thurman knows this. Everyone involved in the project knows who these people are. So if the objective were simply to keep the silos secret, Helen would be one of the worst people in the world to bring inside the operation. Yet they do exactly that. They don't just tell her something. They physically transport her to the place where the silos are being constructed. They put the truth directly in front of her eyes. And that makes me think the real objective isn't preventing Daniel and Helen from discovering the secret. The objective is controlling what they believe that secret means. Because there's a huge difference between hiding information and controlling information. Stenson doesn't have to convince Helen that the silos exist. He's already showing her the evidence. The drilling operation is real. The 51 silos are real. The project is enormous. But the most important question remains unanswered. Why? Why exactly are these structures being built? What happened that made someone decide humanity needed to be buried underground? And perhaps most importantly, who decided that they had the right to make that decision for everyone else? Stenson can show Daniel and Helen a giant hole in the ground and still hide the most important part of the story. He can give them 10 answers while keeping the one answer that matters completely out of reach. And that's something Silo has always understood. Sometimes the most effective form of control isn't keeping people ignorant. It's giving them a carefully selected version of the truth. Helen is the biggest problem for that strategy. Daniel is fascinated by the technology and desperately wants answers, but Helen keeps looking at the people behind the answers. That's why her reaction to the NDA matters. Daniel is willing to sign because he wants to understand what happened. Helen immediately recognizes the trap. She's being asked to surrender the one thing that makes her valuable, her ability to tell the story. And yet, she eventually agrees because she's told she'll be able to write about what she learns within 5 years. That is an incredibly important detail. Whoever is running this operation isn't saying you will never tell anyone, they're saying you can tell them later. That's much more calculated, because by the time those 5 years are over, the world might be completely different. The information may no longer matter. Or perhaps Helen herself will have changed after learning what Stenson is about to reveal. And what if that's exactly what Stenson wants? What if Daniel and Helen are being tested? Imagine that this entire journey is an evaluation. They are given access to the world's greatest secret, and watch to see how they respond. Daniel wants the truth at almost any cost. Helen wants the truth but refuses to surrender her principles. Charlotte wants answers about what happened to her. Stenson can observe all three of them and determine who can be trusted with the future. Because if the silos really are intended to preserve humanity after some catastrophic event, then the people building them aren't simply constructing shelters. They're designing a civilization. And designing a civilization means deciding what kind of people are allowed to shape it. That would explain why Per Stenson's character is so unsettling. His unicorn story sounds like a strange billionaire anecdote at first, but listen to what it reveals about his worldview. He talks about creating something extraordinary, and then rejecting the idea of allowing someone to destroy it for sport. He seems genuinely disgusted by people who acquire something valuable only to dominate or destroy it. On the surface, that makes him sound like a protector. But there is another way to interpret that philosophy. Stenson believes valuable things should be controlled by people who understand their value. And if he applies that philosophy to humanity, then the silos suddenly become much darker. He may genuinely believe he's saving humanity while simultaneously deciding who deserves to inherit it. That's why I don't think Stinson sees himself as the villain. And that could be the most dangerous thing about him. A villain who knows he's evil can be predicted. A man who genuinely believes he's saving civilization can justify almost anything. If Stinson believes the outside world is doomed, then imprisoning thousands of people underground doesn't look like imprisonment to him. It looks like preservation. If he believes human civilization will destroy itself without strict control, then surveillance doesn't look oppressive, it looks necessary. If he believes people can't be trusted with dangerous knowledge, then memory manipulation isn't cruelty, it's maintenance. And suddenly the entire philosophy of the silos starts making sense. Now bring Daniel and Helen back into that picture. What if Stinson wants them to understand this philosophy before the project is complete? What if he's looking for people who can eventually become part of the intellectual foundation of the new civilization? Daniel understands the machinery. Helen understands people. Charlotte represents the consequences of memory manipulation. Together, they possess three things. Stinson may need technical understanding, investigative intelligence, and first-hand experience of what the system can do to a human being. That's far too convenient to dismiss. And there's another detail that bothers me. Stinson is already the richest man in the world, according to the material. He has extraordinary resources. He has access to technology that seems decades ahead of what ordinary people understand. He has political connections. He has Senator Thurman involved. He has a massive drilling operation. So why would he need Daniel and Helen at all? Unless the project isn't finished. Unless there's still a missing piece. Perhaps the silos can preserve bodies, but preserving civilization requires something more. It requires people who understand how to maintain the system. It requires people who can explain why the rules exist. It requires people who can turn an emergency shelter into a functioning society. And that could be where Daniel and Helen become essential. Maybe they're not being recruited to build the silos. Maybe they're being recruited to justify them. Because hundreds of years from now, nobody inside Silo 18 is going to remember Stinson. They're going to remember the rules. They're going to remember that the outside is deadly. They're going to remember that cleaning is required. They're going to remember that questioning the system is dangerous. But where did those ideas originate? Who decided that generations of people should live according to them? The people inside the silos believe their reality is natural because they don't know the people who designed it. Daniel and Helen could be among the first people who understand the philosophy behind the system. And that creates a terrifying possibility for the present-day storyline. What if Juliet isn't fighting something that went wrong? What if she's fighting something that worked exactly as designed? The algorithm may not be a malfunctioning system that gradually became oppressive. The safeguard may not be an emergency measure added later. The memory drugs may not be an accidental consequence of the silo system. Maybe these things are all pieces of a plan that Daniel and Helen are now watching being assembled in front of them. And if Daniel and Helen were chosen rather than captured, there is one final question we need to ask. Chosen for what? Because Stinson isn't showing them the 51 silos out of generosity. He's showing them something. He's testing something. Or he's preparing them for something. And I think the most dangerous possibility is that Daniel and Helen are about to discover that the Silo Project isn't simply about surviving the end of the world. It's about deciding what humanity becomes after the end of the world. If that's true, then Daniel and Helen haven't stumbled into the conspiracy. They've been invited inside it.